Hello everyone, my name is Alexa Chusang and today I am going to talk about the ethnography of communication and its role in discourse analysis. First of all, the ethnography of communication is an approach developed mainly by Del Hymes. It studies how people use language in real social situations and how communication is influenced by culture, context, and social interaction. This approach is important because language is not only about grammar or vocabulary. Communication also depends on cultural rules, relationships between speakers, tone of voice, gestures, and even silence. In other words, people communicate differently depending on their community and social context. For example, in countries like United States or Canada, people often communicate in a direct way and usually express opinions openly during conversations. However, in countries like Japan or South Korea, communication tends to be more indirect because speakers try to maintain harmony and avoid confrontation. A person may say maybe or remain silent instead of directly saying no. The ethnography of communication helps us understand that these differences are cultural, not personal. One of the most important contributions of this approach is the concept of communicative competence. According to Hymes, knowing a language means more than speaking correctly. People must also know when to speak, how to speak, and what is appropriate in different social situations. Another contribution is the speaking model, which is used to analyze communicative events. This model includes setting, refers to the time, place, and atmosphere where communication happens. For example, a classroom, a meeting, or a family dinner. Participants, the people involved in the interaction, including speakers and listeners. For example, the teacher and the students. Ends, the purpose or goal of the communication. For example, giving information, persuading, or greeting. Act sequence, the order and content of what is said during the interaction. For example, first the question, then the answer, and finally the response. Then we have the key, the tone, mood, or manner of communication. For example, serious, formal, or sarcastic. The instrumentalities, the channel or form of communication used. For example, spoken language, written text, phone call, or email. The norms, that are the social rules that control communication and behavior. For example, taking turns while speaking or showing politeness. And finally, the genre, the type of communicative event. For example, conversation, interview, speech, debate, or story. This framework helps researchers understand communication in a deeper and more organized way. Now, let's connect this to discourse analysis. Discourse analysis studies how language is used in spoken, written, or digital communication. The ethnography of communication plays a very important role in discourse analysis because it allows researchers to analyze not only the words people use, but also the cultural and social meanings behind those words. Therefore, discourse analysis studies how people communicate and what communication reveals about things like power, politeness, and identity. Meanwhile, the ethnography of communication helps explain why people communicate differently by considering their cultural background and social context. For example, discourse analysts can compare classroom communication in different countries. In Germany, students are often encouraged to participate actively, ask questions directly, and debate ideas with teachers. In contrast, in countries like South Korea, classroom interaction may be more formal because students are expected to show respect through silence, attentive listening, and waiting for permission to speak. If a discourse analyst studies these classrooms without considering the cultural rules, they could misunderstand students' behavior. A quiet student in South Korea, for example, may appear passive, but in that context, silence can represent respect and discipline. This approach is especially useful in multicultural and educational contexts. In EFL classrooms, for example, students need to learn not only grammar, but also how to communicate appropriately with different people of different cultures. Teacher can use cultural examples, role plays, and authentic interactions to develop students' communicative competence. In conclusion, the ethnography of communication is essential because it helps us understand how language, culture, and society are connected. Its role in discourse analysis is fundamental since it allows us to interpret communication more deeply, considering context, culture, and human interaction. Thank you for watching.